students and scholars, teachers and trainers, professors and professionals, learners and listeners, those who are listening from the field of science, religion, spirituality, arts, commerce, engineering, the most honorable President Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji, honorable advocates, advertisers, administrators and advisors, reverend fathers and mothers, affectionate sons and daughters. I, Dr. RKM from USA, heartily, cordially welcome all of you. It is really nice time, nice place, nice action, listening the truth of language and literature through science and spirituality. Dear friends, all the students of literature, those who are studying in Harvard, Cambridge, Oxford, all over the world in the different universities, they follow the rule of nature. It is very necessary, everyone is to follow the rule and regulations of nature. Nature also has destined and prescribed some rules for the man to follow. If we follow judiciously and we take the help of our God-gifted mind, then we walk in the right direction for the welfare of humanity, for the welfare of our society and nation. Our whole surroundings, atmosphere, environment that we have around us, that does matter in our formative years of life. Actually, our emotions, sensations, and the rays of light, waves of sound that are recollected and collected by our mind at the different time with the heartbeat. Doctors know very well that our heart beats 72 times in 1 minute. They judge its pulse rate, they judge its BP, temperature, pressure, all the things. But one thing is very close with the spiritual world, that is tested by, that is investigated by, probed by only the spiritual father. Our spiritual father, who is the scientist of scientists, who is the doctor of doctors, who is known as the king of kings, to whom we say duke of dukes, duchess of duchesses, god of goddesses. So dear friends, that can be experienced and observed through the presence of nature. Around our soul we have a circle of negativities, but this circle can be broken, this circle can be discovered only by those inventors of the soul, only by those innovators of the soul, those who spent their time in providing the truth of science and spirituality with their practicals. It's the matter of practical and experiment. Then that practical and experiment becomes our experience. So dear friends, experiences are recorded and historically are kept in our mind and heart forever permanently. That shows the path to our youngsters, to our futuristic generation. Dear friends, time and again I would like to say that our true scholars, researchers are those who are doing research on the past, because the glimpse of past, glory of past is really attractive, enchanting, allurementative for the present time, especially in case of our Indian culture. When we study about its strongest feature, unity in diversity, then we knows this thing that nature also created itself in the form of varieties. Nature has variations, color, size, shape, figure, everything nature has. As per the study of nature, we have decided to write our holy scripture in the presence of the holy spiritual fathers. They came on this holy land and they wrote that holy words, that holy thoughts which came in their mind from the sky. So it is really praiseworthy, admirable and appreciable for all of us. In praise of the nature, words fall short. If we have familiarity and friendly relations with nature, then this nature fills us with everlasting joy and rejoice of mind. Dear friends, our students of literature, those who are doing research in the different universities in India and all over the world, the age of Elizabeth, what was the starting of it? 1550 to 1620. Its ending period was 1620. In the age of Elizabeth, all doubt seems to vanish from English history. After the reasons of Edward and Mary, with defeat and humiliation abroad and persecutions and rebellion at home, the accession of a popular sovereign was like the sunrise after a long night. And in Milton's words, we suddenly see England, a noble and puissant nation, rousing herself like a strong man after sleep and shaking her invincible locks. With the queen's character, a strange mingling of frivolity and strength, which reminds one of that iron image with feet of clay. We have nothing whatever to do. It is the national life that concerns the literary student, since even a beginner must notice that any great development of the national life is invariably associated with a development of the national literature. It is enough for our purpose, therefore, to point out two facts: that Elizabeth, with all her vanity and inconsistency, steadily loved England and England's greatness, and that she inspired all her people with the unbounded patriotism which exults in Shakespeare, and with the personal devotion which finds a voice in the Fairy Queen. Under her administration, the English national life progressed by gigantic leaps rather than by slow historical processes, and English literature reached the very highest point of its development. It is possible to indicate only a few general characteristics of this great age, which had a direct bearing upon its literature. What are the characteristics of the Elizabethan age? Dear scholars of English literature, every age starts with a great turning and twisting of the thoughts. So, what are the characteristics of Elizabethan age? We must know that how the age brought revolutionary and visionary changes in the thoughts of readers and in the minds of people. The most characteristic feature of the age was the comparative religious tolerance, which was 30 years war on the continental, found no parallel in England. Upon her accession, Elizabeth found the whole kingdom divided against itself. While the southern counties were as strongly Protestant, Scotland had followed the Reformation in its own intense way. Scotland remained true to its old old religious traditions, and both countries were openly rebellious. The court, made up of, witnessed the rival intrigues of those who sought to gain the royal favor. It was due partly to the intense absorption of men's minds in religious questions that the preceding century, advancing learning, produced scarcely any literature worthy of the name. Elizabeth favored both religious parties, and presently the world saw with amazement Catholic and Protestants acting together as trusted counselors of a great sovereign. The defeat of the Spanish Armada established the Reformation as a fact in England, and at the same time united all Englishmen in a magnificent national enthusiasm. For the first time since the Reformation began, the fundamental question of religious tolerance seemed to be settled, and the mind of man, freed from religious fears and persecutions, turned with a great creative impulse to other forms of activity. It is partly from this new freedom of the mind that the age of Elizabeth received its great literary stimulus. It was an age of comparative social contentment, in strong contrast with the days of Langland. The rapid increase of manufacturing towns gave employment to thousands who had before been idle and discontented. Increasing trade was wealth to England, and this wealth was shared to this extent at least that for the first time some systematic care for the needy was attempted. Perhaps were made responsible for their own poor, and the wealthy were taxed to support them or give them employment. The increase of wealth, the improvement in living, the opportunities for labor, the new social content. There also are factors which help to account for the new literary activity. It is an age of dreams, of adventure, of unbounded enthusiasm springing from the new lands of fabulous riches revealed by English explorers. Drake sails shaping the mighty courses which England colonizes, English colonizers shall follow through the centuries. And presently, the young philosopher Bacon is saying confidently, I have taken all knowledge for my province. The mind must search farther than the eye, with new rich lands open to the sight. The imagination must create new forms to people, the new words. Hakluyt's famous collection of voyages and perchance his pilgrimages were even more stimulating to the English imagination than to the English acquisitiveness, while her explorers search the new world for the her poets are creating literary works that are young forever. Marston writes, why men all their dripping pens are pure gold. The prisoners they take are fettered in gold, and as for rubies and diamonds, they go forth on holidays and gather them by the seashore to hang on their children's cots. This comes nearer to being a description of Shakespeare's poetry than of the Indian in Virginia. Prospero in the Tempest, with his control over the mighty power, his harmonies of nature, is only the literary dream of that science which had just begun to grapple with the forces of the universe. Cabot, Drake, Frobisher, Gilbert, Raleigh, Willoughby, Hawkins, a score of explorers reveal a new age to man's eyes, and instantly literature creates a new heaven to match it. So dreams and deeds increase side by side, and the dream is ever greater than the deed. That is the meaning of literature. To sum up, the age of Elizabeth was a time of intellectual liberty, intelligence, and comfort among all classes, of unbounded patriotism, and of peace at home and abroad. For a parallel, we must go back to the age of Pericles in Athens, or of Augustus in Rome, magnificent court of Louis XIV, when Corneille, Racine, and Molière brought the drama in France to the point where Marlowe, Shakespeare, and Johnson had left it in England half a century earlier. Such an age of great thought and great action, appealing to the eyes as well as the imaginations and intellect, finds but one adequate literary expression. Neither poetry nor the story can express the whole man, his thought, feeling, action, and resulting character. Hence, in the age of Elizabeth, literature turned instinctively to the drama and brought it rapidly to the highest stage of its development. The known dramatic poets of the Elizabethan age: Edmund Spenser from 1552 to 1599, Spenser reveals his own heart unconsciously. Spenser revealed his own heart unconsciously, perhaps, as no biographer could possibly do. His life and work seem to center about three great influences, summed up in three names: Cambridge, where he grew acquainted with the classics and the Italian poets; London, where he experienced the glamour and disappointment of court life; the Ireland, which stabbed him in the beauty and imagery of old Celtic poetry and first gave him leisure to write his masterpiece. Life of Spenser's early life and percentage we know little, except that he was born in East Smithfield near the Tower of London and was poor. His education began at the Merchant Taylor's School in London and was continued in Cambridge, where a poor Caesar and fag for wealthy students, he earned a cent living. Here in the glorious world that only a poet scholar knows how to create for himself, he read the classics, made acquaintance with the great Italian poets, and wrote numberless little poems of his own. Though Chaucer was his beloved master, his ambition was not to rival the Canterbury Tales, but rather to express the dream of English chivalry, much as Aristotle had done for Italy in Orlando Furioso. After leaving Cambridge 1576, Spenser went to the north of England on some unknown work or quest. Here his chief occupation was to fall in love and to record his melancholy over the lost Rosalind in the shepherd's calendar. Upon his friend Harvey's advice, he came to London bringing his poems, and here he met Leicester, then at the height of royal favour, and the latter took him to live at Leicester's house. Here he finished the shepherd's calendar, and here he met Sidney and all the Queen's favourites. The court was full of intrigues, lying and flattery, and Spenser's opinion of his own uncomfortable position is best expressed in a few lines from Mother Hubbard's Tales in 1580. Through Leicester's influence, Spenser, who was utterly weary of his dependent position, was made secretary to Lord Grey, the Queen's deputy in Ireland, and the third period of his life began. He accompanied his chief through one campaign of savage brutality in putting down an Irish rebellion, and was given an immense estate with the castle of Kilcolman in Munster, which had been confiscated from Earl Desmond, one of the Irish leaders. His life here, where according to the terms of his grant, he must reside as an English settler, he regarded as lonely exile. My luckless lot that banished, but had myself like a weight for loss into that waste where I was quite forgot. It is interesting to note here a gentle poet's view of the unhappy island. After nearly 16 years residence, he wrote his view of the state of Ireland 1596, his only prose work in which he submits a plan for pacifying the oppressed and rebellious people. This was to bring a huge force of chivalry and infantry into the country, give the Irish a brief time to submit, and after that to hunt them down like wild beasts. He calculated that cold, famine, and sickness would help the work of the sword, and that after the rebels had been well hounded for 2 winters, the following summer would find the company the following summer will find the country peaceful. This plan from the poet of harmony and beauty was somewhat milder than the usual treatment of a brave people whose offense was that they loved liberty and religion. Strange as it may seem, the view was considered most statesmanlike and was excellently well received in England. In Kilcolman, surrounded by great natural beauty, Spencer finished the first 3 books of the Fairy Queen. In 1589, Raleigh visited him, heard the poem with enthusiasm, hurried the poet off to London, and presented him to Elizabeth. The first 3 books met with instant success when published and were acclaimed as the greatest work in the English language. A yearly pension of £50 was conferred by Elizabeth, but rarely paid, and the poet turned back to exile, that is, to Ireland again. Soon after his return, Spencer finished the first 3 books of Fairy Queen in 1589. Soon after his return, Spencer fell in love with his beautiful Elizabeth, an Irish girl, in her honor, and afterwards represented her in the Fairy Queen as the beautiful woman dancing among the graces. In 1594, he married Elizabeth, celebrating his wedding with his epithalamion of the most beautiful wedding hymns in any language. Spencer's next visit to London was in 1595 when he published Astrophel, an elegy on the death of his Sydney. Three more books of the Fairy Queen. On this visit, he lived again at Leicester House, now occupied by the new favorite Essex, where he probably met Shakespeare and the other literary lights of the Elizabethan age. Soon after his return to Ireland, Spencer was appointed Sheriff of Cork, a queer office for a poet, which probably brought about his undoing. The same year, Tyrant's rebellion broke out in the Munster. Kilcolman, the ancient house of Desmond, was one of the first places attacked by the rebels, and Spencer barely escaped with his wife and two children. It is supposed that some unfinished parts of the Fairy Queen were burned in the castle. From the shock of the frightful experience, Spencer never recovered. He returned to England heartbroken, and in the following year, 1599, he died in an inn at Westminster. According to the Ben Jonson, he died for want of bread. But whether that is a poetic way of saying that he had lost his property or that he actually died of destitution will probably never be known. He was buried beside his master Chaucer in Westminster Abbey. The poets of that age thronging to his funeral, and according to Camden, casting their elegies and pens that had written them into his tomb. How was and what was the Spencer's works? The Fairy Queen is the great work upon which the poet's fame chiefly rests. The original plan of the poem included 24 books, each of which was to recount the adventure and triumph of a knight who represented a moral virtue. Spencer's purpose, as indicated in a letter to Religue, which introduces the poem, is as follows. To puritrate in Arthur, Arthur before he was king, the image of a brave knight, perfected in the 12 private moral virtues, as Aristotle hath devised, which is the books, which if I find to be well accepted, I may be perhaps encouraged to frame the other part of the politic virtues in his person. After that, he came to be. Dear friends, each of the virtues appear as a knight, as a warrior, fighting his opposing vice, and the poem tells the story of the conflicts. It is therefore purely allegorical, and not only in its personified virtues but also in its representation of life as a struggle between good and evil. In its strong moral element, the poem differs radically from Orlando Furioso, upon which it was modeled. Spencer completed only 6 books, celebrating holiness, temperance, chastity, friendship, justice, and courtesy. We have also a fragment of the 7th treating of a constancy. But the rest of this book was not written or else was lost in the first at Kilcolman. The first 3 books were by far the best, and judging by the way the interest lags and the allegory grows incomprehensible, it is perhaps as well for Spencer's reputation that the other 18 books remained a dream. Argument of the Fairy Queen. From the introductory letter, we learn that the hero visits the queen's court in fairyland. While she is holding a 12 days festival, on each day, some distressed person appears unexpectedly, tells a woeful story of dragon, of enchantresses, or of distressed beauty or virtue, and asks for a champion to right the wrong and to let the oppressed go free. Sometimes a knight volunteers or begs for the dangerous mission. Again, the duty is assigned by the queen, and the journeys and adventures of these knights are the subjects of the several books. The first recounts the adventures of the Red Cross Knight, representing holiness, and the Lady Yuna, representing religion. Their contests are symbolical of the worldwide struggle between virtue and faith on the one hand, and sin and heresy on the other. The second book tells the story of Sir Guion or temperance, the third of Britomeritis, representing chastity, the fourth, fifth, and sixth of Chambellan and Trimont, friendship, article, justice, and Sir Calidor, courtesy. Spencer's plan was very classical. Spencer's plan was very elastic one, and he filled up the measure of his narrative with everything that caught his fancy. Historical events and personages under allegorical mask, beautiful ladies, chivalrous knights, giants, monsters, dragons, sirens, enchanters, and adventures enough to stoke a liberty of fiction. If you read Homer or Virgil, you know his subject in the first strong line. If you read Cadman's paraphrases or Milton's epic, the introduction gives you the theme. But Spencer's great poem, with the exception of the single line in the prologue, fires, wars, and faithful loves shall moralize my song, gives hardly a hint of what is coming. as the meaning of the allegorical figures. One is generally in doubt. In the first three books, the shadowy fairy queen sometimes represents the glory of God and sometimes Elizabeth, who was naturally flattered by the parallel. Britomeritis is also Elizabeth. The Red Cross Knight is Sydney. The model Englishman, Arthur, who always appears to rescue the oppressed in Leicester, which is another outrageous flattery. Una is sometimes religious, Una is sometimes religion and sometimes the Protestant Church, while Dusa represents Mary Queen of Scots or general Catholicism. In the last three books, Elizabeth appears again as Marcella, Henry IV of France as Burton, as Bourbon, the war in the Netherlands as the story of Lady Bells, Relique as Tymans, the Earl of Northumberland and Westmoreland as Blandamour and Paridel, and so on through the wide range of contemporary characters and events till the becomes as difficult to follow as the second part of Goethe's first. Poetical form for the fairy queen, Spenser invented a new verse form which has been called his the Spenserian stanza. Because of its rare beauty, it has been much used by nearly all our poets in their best work. The new stanza was an improved form of Aristotle's Ottawa Rima and bears a close resemblance to one of the Chaucer's most musical verse forms in the Monk's Tale. Spenser's stanza is in 9 lines, 8 of 5 feet each and the last of 6 feet, rhyming AB, ABB, CD, CC. A few selections from the first book, which is best worth reading, are reproduced here to show the style and melody of the verse. Dear friends, continue listening the literature. These are the words of literature, holy words of literature that will make you able to understand the word of literature. All over the world you will be able to understand the different cultures of the different nations. Some of the minor poets you will understand, listen. Next to his masterpiece, The Shepherd's Calendar, 1579, is the best known of Spenser's poems. Though as his first work, it is below many others in melody. It consists of 12 pastoral poems or eclogues, one for each month of the year. The themes are generally rural life, nature, love in the fields. And the speakers are shepherd and shepherdesses. To increase the rustic effect, Spenser uses strange forms of speech and obsolete words to such an extent that Johnson complained his works are not English or any other language. Some are melancholy poems on his lost Rosalind. Some are satires on the clergy. One, The Briar and the Oak, is an allegory. One flatters Elizabeth. The others are pure fables touched with the Puritan spirit. They are written in various styles and meters and show plainly that Spencer was practicing and preparing himself for greater work. Other noteworthy poems are Mother Hubbard, Mother Hubbard's Tale, a satire on society, Astrophel and Elegy on the death of Sidney, Amoreti or sonnets to his Elizabeth, the marriage hymns, Epithalamion, and four hymns on love, beauty, heavenly love, and heavenly beauty. There are numerous other poems and collections of poems, but these show the scope of his work and are best worth reading. Dear friends, try to must understand the importance of the Shepherd's Calendar. The publication of this work in 1579 by an unknown writer who signed himself modestly Emerito marks an important epoch in our literature. We shall appreciate this better if we remember the long years during which England had been without a great poet. Chaucer and Spencer are often studied together as poets of the Renaissance period, and the idea prevails that they were almost contemporary. In fact, nearly 2 centuries passed after Chaucer's death, years of enormous political and intellectual development, and not only did Chaucer have no successor, but our language had changed so rapidly that Englishmen had lost the ability to read his lines correctly. This first published work of Spencer is noteworthy in at least four respects. First, it marks the appearance of the first national poet in 2 centuries. Second, it shows again the variety and melody of English verse, which had been largely a tradition since Chaucer. Third, it was our first pastoral, the beginning of a long series of English pastoral compositions modelled on Spencer, and as such exerted a strong influence on subsequent literature. And fourth, it marks the real beginning of a outburst of great Elizabethan poetry. Dear friends, now you are listening from Dr.RK's USA, The Truth of Language and Literature. Characteristics of the five main qualities of Spencer's poetry are a perfect melody, a rare sense of beauty, a splendid imagination which could gather into one poem heroes, knights, ladies, dwarfs, demons and dragons, classic mythology, stories of chivalry, and the thronging ideals of the Renaissance, all passing in gorgeous procession across an ever-changing and ever-beautiful landscape. A lofty moral purity and seriousness, a delicate idealism which could make all nature and every common thing beautiful. In contrast with these excellent qualities, the reader will probably note the strange appearance of his lines due to his fondness to obsolete words like eyes, shand means shame, and his tendency to coin others like mercify. It is Spencer's idealism, his love of beauty, and his exquisite melody, which have caused him to be known as the poet's poet. Nearly all our subsequent singers acknowledge their delight in him and their indebtedness. Macaulay alone among critics voices a fault which all who are not poets quickly feel, namely that with all the Spencer's excellence, with all the Spencer's excellences, he is difficult to read. The modern man loses himself in the confused allegory of the fairy queen, skips all but the marked passages, and softly closes the book in gentle weariness, even the best of his longer poems, while the exquisite workmanship and delightfully melodious generally fail to hold the reader's attention. The movement is languid. There is little dramatic interest. The only suggestion of humor, the very melody of his verses sometimes grows monotonous, like a Strauss waltz too long continued. We shall best appreciate Spenser by reading at first only a few well chosen selections from the Fairy Queen and the Shepherd's Calendar, a few of the minor poems which exemplify his wonderful melody. Comparison between Chaucer and Spenser. At the outset, it is well to remember that though Spenser regarded Chaucer as his master, two centuries intervene between them, and that their writings have almost nothing in common. We shall appreciate this better by a brief comparison between our first two modern poets. Chaucer was a combined poet and man of affairs, with the latter predominating, though dealing largely with ancient or medieval material. He has a curiously modern way of looking at life. Indeed, he is our only author preceding Shakespeare with whom we feel thoroughly at home. He threw aside the outgrown metrical romance, which was practically the only form of narrative in his day, invented the art of storytelling in verse, and brought it to a degree of perfection which has probably never since been equaled. Though a student of the classics, he lived wholly in the present, studied the men and women of his own time, painted them as they were, but added always a touch of kindly humor or romance to make them more interesting. So his passion appears to be simply to amuse himself and his readers. His mastery of various and melodious verse was marvelous and has never been surpassed in our language. But the English of his day was changing rapidly, and in a very few years men were unable to appreciate his art, so that even to Spenser and Dryden, for example, he seemed deficient in metrical skill. On this account, his influence on our literature has been much less than we should. Dear friends, continue listening. All the literary giants and linguistic scholars, those who are learning language, especially English language, readers, writers, speakers and listeners, go through the English literature. This English literature will help them, provide them glimpse and mirror of the past. It is rightly said by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, our present lies in the past. So you must go through the different literary culture and climates of the different nations. Like Chaucer of affairs, but in him the poet and the scholar always predominates. He writes as the idealist, like Plato. Like Plato, he writes as the idealist, describing men not as they are, but as he thinks they should be. He has no humor, and his mission is not to amuse but to reform, like William Shakespeare and Plato. Like Chaucer, he studies the classics and contemporary French and Italian writers, but instead of adapting his material to present day conditions, he makes poetry as in his accusation more artificial even than his foreign models, where thank you for listening. Knowledgeable, informative, instructive and directive words of English literature through science and spirituality. We were discussing earlier about Chaucer, where Chaucer looks about him and describes life as he sees it. Spencer always looks backward for his inspiration. He lives dreamily in the past, in a realm of purely imaginary emotions and adventures. His first quality is imagination, not observation, but he is the first of our poets to create a world of dreams, fancies, and illusions. His second quality is a wonderful sensitiveness to beauty, which shows itself not only in his subject matter but also in the manner of his poetry. Like Chaucer, he is an almost perfect workman, but in reading Chaucer, we think chiefly of his natural characters or his ideas, while in reading Spencer, we think of the beauty of expression. The exquisite Spencerian stanza and the rich melody of Spencer's verse have made him the model of all our modern poets. Dear friends, you are listening The Truth of Science and Spirituality.